Right, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Julia Matevosyan. I'm the Chief Engineer at Energy Systems Integration Group. ESIG also serves in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or G-PST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scale and speed. This is being done by providing coordinated and holistic approach to the necessary knowledge, education, and support power system operators across 5 action pillars. The foundation of G-PST is a group of 6 system operators from around the globe who are facing higher penetration of wind, solar, and inverter-based resources. And they are doing it sooner rather than other operators in the world. The 5 pillars of the consortium are research and peer learning, technical support, workforce development, technology adoption support, and open data and tools. ESIG is a lead on Pillar 1, which is research and peer learning. And more information on G-PST can be found at www.globalpst.org. As a lead of Pillar 1, ESIG would like to welcome you to the October monthly webinar of our joint G-PST Pillar 1 ESIG webinar series. The series is in addition to regular ESIG monthly webinar series and focuses on G-PST research agenda and associated topics being addressed in Pillar 1. Topics are presented by both funding system operators and other advanced system operators active in Pillar 1, as well as members of industry and academia participating in activities of Research Agenda Group and Research Advisory Committee of Pillar 1. An additional series of webinars on other 4 pillars of G-PST is also being provided on a monthly basis through NREL. For those of you who would like to learn more about G-PST and how to engage, please go to www.globalpst.org and click on Get Involved tab. Further information on ESIG can be found at www.esig.energy. Next, I would like to go over a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, the phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid any unnecessary distraction. For the Q&A, we use Slido platform at slido.com. You need to open a browser window to go to slido.com and enter ESIG20 as event code. So that's again ESIG20. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. You will see a thumbs up button next to questions on Slido, and this allows you to cast your vote and help us prioritize questions submitted. We plan to save about 10-15 minutes for Q&A at the end and wrap up at the top of the hour. We also plan to provide short responses to all unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your question on Slido. Okay, so today our webinar is going to cover probabilistic resource adequacy methods. The webinar will feature Derek Stenclik. Derek is founding partner of Telos Energy, an analytics and consulting firm specializing in renewable integration, system planning, and grid modeling. Prior to founding Telos Energy, Derek spent 8 years at GE Power Energy Consulting Department as a senior manager of power system strategy. He holds a Master of Science degree in Applied Economics and Management from Cornell University and BA in International Relationships from the State University of New York. I'm pleased to have Derek with us today. The webinar will provide an update on what's happening in the world in probabilistic resource adequacy methods. The presentation will cover novel approaches of modeling resource adequacy across broad ranges and consideration of extreme weather, modeling approaches of battery energy storage, effects of correlated outages of thermal generators, and considering benefits of transmission, and much more. Okay, just a short reminder again, use Slido for your questions at slido.com with an event code ESIG20 to ask your questions. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Derek, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you everyone else for tuning in. I'm really excited to share this presentation with you all. For those of you who will be at ESIG's workshop next week in Minneapolis, I'll catch many of you there. So looking forward to that as well. So again, kind of picking up where Julia left off, I'm going to share some best practices of resource adequacy methods from around the world. I took a little bit of a different track this time around, where as opposed to kind of highlighting one of the studies that I've done somewhere in the world, I decided to really collate what I think is some really great work I've seen across the industry over the past year, tying it back to some of the ESIG foundational principles that we developed last year. So really trying to pick and choose some work from across the industry, some of it being work that Telos has done, others from other groups around the country and around the world. So really looking forward to share that. A little bit different take this time around, so very interested to hear what people have to think about this type of format. So I'll start by kind of going over the ESIG Redefining Resource Adequacy Task Force. This is something that was kicked off really in the very beginning of 2021. If you remember, we were all, or hopefully many of you were here this time last year, where I presented a webinar on redefining resource adequacy for modern power systems. So this is something that's been going on for, call it the better part of 2 years within ESIG. We've brought together a task force of experts really across the industry around the world to talk about some of the changing ways we need to think about resource adequacy and reliability planning generally as we work through the energy transition. So a lot of stuff here, you have the reports and webinars, links to that off to the right. I'll be touching on some of the concepts from that, and very soon, just a bit of a shout out to some work we are doing now as part of the task force. We will have a paper on capacity accreditation, which is kind of the same side or alternative side to the coin of resource adequacy planning. That will be coming out shortly, I would say, hopefully by the end of the year. So as we work to finish that. And getting into the specifics of the projects I wanted to highlight today. This is the reading list. So if I know everybody has a very long reading list of things they want to get to and reports they want to review. I collated here what I think were 9 that I really wanted to cover today. If you haven't done so already, please go out, at least look at the slide deck version of these, if not the full report. Again, I'll be drawing on some of the highlights from each of these as I go through the presentation today. Again, I'll try to weave it together into a narrative that it goes with. But again, I'll be drawing on work, just kind of really quickly going through this. The ESIG Transmission Benefits Project and understanding resource adequacy implications of transmission is one project. For those of you who were able to tune into last week's Grid Lab or presentation for ESIG from Elaine Hart and Anna Maleva from that supported the Grid Lab project on the Western resource adequacy analysis. I thought that was great. I wanted to highlight a few things that tie into some of the key principles. Of the MISO Regional Resource Assessment, I think they've been really pushing the boundaries, at least from what I've seen at some of the different ISOs, in how they're addressing resource adequacy and weather risk. So really wanted to highlight some of that work. Off in the top right, so ENSOE has for a few years now done the European Resource Adequacy Assessment. I'll highlight some really nice things that I think they're doing there on a really pan-continental view. Some stuff. While this presentation will be a little bit North American focused, I'll try to highlight that and really try to weave in how I think some of the stuff ENSOE is doing in Europe is something we can and should be doing here in North America. Down in the bottom row, this is a project that Telos supported with Grid Lab. It came out this year looking at California's reliability implications of their energy transition out to 2030. We took a different spin on resource adequacy, so I wanted to highlight some of the key concepts that we put out there. EPRI right now is doing kind of a multi-year initiative on resource adequacy planning. It involves multiple case studies around North America, and again, work that we're involved in and wanted to highlight as well. For those of you who haven't seen, E3 came out with resource adequacy in the Desert Southwest, where they worked with a host of multiple utilities in the region and did a joint resource adequacy assessment, kind of reaching their future kind of 2030-ish goals. So wanted to highlight that. And then on the bottom right, 2 papers on temperature dependencies of forced outages and thermal units. That's something we'll touch on quite a bit. So Sinat Murphy applied energy paper there, and off to the bottom right, accrediting resource adequacy, value to thermal generation, some work that Astrape put out this year that I thought was really seminal, really groundbreaking work. So again, some of this is my work, other work is, or work I was involved in. Other work is from other folks in the industry. I reached out to all of them, made sure they were okay with me highlighting it. And again, a lot of these reports, this is what keeps me going, keeps me hustling. It's a lot of great work and trying to always keep up with. There's obviously reports on here reports out there that I didn't get to, and also a lot of good work, not enough time to highlight it all. I see a chat coming in on the Slido. So links, yes, they're all here. Want to make sure, give credit where credit is due and make sure everybody can easily go grab that. So getting into the guts of the presentation here, wanted to start by a recap of the presentation from last year. So for those of you who have been following the work ESIG has been putting out in this space on redefining resource adequacy, we developed, the task force developed 6 principles for resource adequacy of modern power systems. If you haven't seen these, we have the ESIG report listed on this that kind of goes into each of these in detail. The webinar last year covers them. I'm going to really try to go down and highlight a few of these and tie in where I think there's been really great work over the past year in some of these case studies that highlights each of these as really good examples. The first is around chronological operations must be modeled across many weather years. This was really the foundational element of the work that ESIG put out over the past year and a half, 2 years, and really kind of the shift away from convolution methods for resource adequacy, which just does sampling around forced outages and looks at the load levels, and really gets into how does the system actually operate from hour to hour across the year. That's really important for things like modeling weather-dependent resources like wind and solar, also weather-dependent resources like that on the thermal side. So making sure we get that chronology, making sure we link it to weather years, and then that gets even more important for modeling energy-limited resources like storage or load flexibility, which its availability in 1 hour is very dependent on hours before and hours after, and so they're energy-limited resources. We really need to get the chronology of the system in. And for those of you who've been following the ESIG work, you've heard me say that a lot over the past couple of years. The good news is I think this has become really standard industry practice over the past couple of years. And all of the case studies I highlighted previously did something like that. Now, where I think we as an industry can improve is around specifically how we tie in weather years to that analysis. So I wanted to highlight a few case studies here that I think did this really well. And so the first, again, for those of you who were able to catch the webinar last week when this report dropped, is from the Grid Lab Western Resource Adequacy Assessment and the Grid Path RA Modeling Toolkit work. And they really laid out this idea around, well, let's get multiple weather years. What's the weather data that we have available today across a wide region? So the key thing here is this is a consistent data set across the entire Western United States. And you can see where there's data availability. So load from 2006 to 2020, that aligns with the FERC 714 filings. Thermal derates going back to 1998, those are largely temperature dependent, so there's always great data on the temperature side. Wind was coming from the wind toolkit from 2007 to 2014, and then solar from the NREL MSRDB from 98 to 2019. And you can see there's like overlapping years, and ideally you want a really large data set, and you can pick and choose whether you go all the way back to 1998, you go back further. But the key thing is to get consistent data, correlated data across all of these properties across a wide region. And I thought what that paper did really well was looked at, well, how do we make sure we're using consistent data? How do we fill these gaps around synthetic data for wind to make that go out further? And they approached that with some really novel ways. So I encourage you to go take a look at that. It's also a topic of an ESIG task force right now that Justin Sharp is leading, along with a wide array of kind of atmospheric science experts, weather modeling experts, and power system experts that really looks at, well, first, when we have gaps in the data, like I just highlighted, what's the best way to fill that? And then on top of that, what data should we have available? Again, pan-national, pan-continental, really wide geographies. That's a key thing that I think we need. There's been a lot of great progress with this over the past couple of years. And then one thing that I thought the report did really well is got into individual events and really dove deep into periods when there was loss of load expectation, when there was risk of not having enough resources on the system. They went in and developed these great maps that show, well, what was the temperature doing across the region, what was the cloud cover, what was the wind speed, and really started to visualize where we're seeing risk, or when there's risk, what's going on in the weather conditions across the system. So you heard me say a couple times the need for this pan-continental or pan-national weather data set. And the key thing here is to get consistent data across all of these factors. So to make sure we're pulling the same data across each of the regions to make sure we're picking up the correlations. So the key thing here is having correlated data sets across all of these weather properties. So to point to a best practice where I've seen this done really well, and probably the best in the industry, is the ENSOE project coming out of Europe, where for the ERAA assessment, they developed a pan-European climatological data set. So it spanned 35 weather years, and what they did with that is a single analysis for all of Europe. It covered 39 TOs, 35 countries, and across a wide array of weather conditions. And again, the reason this is becoming so important in the resource adequacy analysis is as the system shifts to one that is largely dependent on wind, solar, energy storage, and clean resources, the weather dependency on the resource side is increasing significantly. So now the system, which has always been kind of predicated on what the weather is doing and largely load being very linked to temperatures, it's becoming more and more dependent on the underlying weather conditions. So making sure we get that right is going to be critical. So it's not just the resources. I have here kind of the different wind resources across the weather years. It's also the load is becoming even more weather dependent. It always has been. And now as we're seeing electrification of transportation, we're seeing electrification of buildings and heating demand, you're only going to see the weather dependency on the load increase over time. So that's going to be really critical. And then on top of that, there's a climate trend as well. So all of this is not only is the system becoming more dependent or reliant on the underlying weather conditions, those weather conditions are changing over time because of climate change. And so really understanding that becomes critical. Again, that's something, a best practice I've seen out of this ERAA assessment, which also includes climate trends. So just wanted to highlight the ESIG task force one other time. It's kind of, this I think is a real opportunity for North America. And so the objective of that task force is to really outline what is this multi-year continental data set? What does that look like? How should it be developed? And with the idea that at some point, an entity, whether it's DOE, whether it's NERC, whether it's somebody else, has to go out and really procure and curate this data set that can be used to provide consistent weather data across many years of weather across all regions and really make sure we're all on the same foot. It would be great, I guess, a plug for John Mora and the rest of the NERC folks, to have some independent, large-scale national assessment of resource adequacy, similar to what ERAA is doing in Europe, would be really impressive. So with that, I'll kind of move on to kind of a highlight of why these multiple years of weather are important. So this is an example from some work that we've been doing in ERCOT, and this is part of that EPRI Resource Adequacy Initiative, where we're modeling an ERCOT case study for resource adequacy, kind of looking out in the future with high levels of renewables coming on the system. And for that, we use 40 years of weather data. Again, it's 40 years of load, so getting the temperature dependencies of that. and then 40 years of wind and solar data. And this is kind of project by project specific for both existing and future resources. And so we have this nice correlated data set for load, wind, and solar. Fortunately, ERCOT provided that for load, as well as they contract with UL to develop this historical wind and solar assessment. So really great data availability in ERCOT. And I want to highlight why this is important, because if you look in 2023, we chart LOLE, or loss of load events, by weather year. You can see a chart, and when you look across 40 weather years, you see a system where each of these years is brought to a 1-day and 10-year reliability criterion. You can see in 2023, kind of today's resource mix, almost all of the risk is popping up in a handful of years, 2000, 2003, and then 2010 to 2012. And when you look at that, those are all years which were higher than normal summer peak demand periods. So if you look up the top chart, you can see that year's weather demand relative to the P50 or the 40-year average. And you can see the orange line is in summer peak demand, the winter is in blue. And again, this is percent back to the average for that season. And you can see the loss of load events are kind of clustered in these summer or kind of periods where there's summer and winter risk. Now, when we kind of shift to 2030, you start to see the risk shift back to, in this case, the 80s period, where there happened to be much higher than average winter peak load events. And so you can see the main reason for that, almost the exclusive reason for that, is as we moved out to 2030, we retired a lot of thermal generation, we replaced it with wind, solar, and storage. And so even though the system has the exact same overall risk, it's 0.1 days per year, LOLE, you see the risk shift to periods where it's winter peaking. And so we see ERCOT become a winter peaking system somewhere between 2020, or sorry, not winter peaking, winter risk system somewhere between 2026 and 2030. And the other key thing here is you could ask, well, should we be using data from the 80s if there's a climate trend? Well, that's a great question. Work we're doing now to uncover that. The other thing is, if you look back at Winter Storm Uri, and even this past year, we saw winter events that were equally as challenging as these outliers in the 80s. So really important, again, to capture a long historical record and get correlation across those data sets. So moving on to the second bullet around kind of quantifying size, frequency, duration, and timing of capacity shortfalls. For those of you who've worked with me or heard me in the past, you'll hear me repeat this on a common refrain. I've become somewhat squeamish to resource adequacy analysis that only looks at loss of load expectation and says, well, the system is either at a 0.1 LOLE or it's not, and we leave it at that and we move on. I think there's a lot of importance kind of drilling into risk and really trying to understand when there are loss of load events, when there is reliability risk on the system, what does that risk look like? What's driving the risk when we do have unserved energy events? How large is it? How long does it last for? When is it occurring? And this is really critical. Like now that we have traditionally, the mitigations to improve reliability were a combustion turbine, and you just built that. And some of these factors didn't really matter because it was uniformly available across the year, or at least that was the assumption, and when it could operate for many hours at a time. Now we have a large suite of mitigation options. We still have the CT, obviously. We also have storage, demand response, wind, solar, and all these other resources. And so making sure we right size that in terms of all these properties becomes critical. So if we're going to rely on these new resources for reliability, we really need to understand what that underlying risk profile looks like. And so for that, again, there's been a lot of great work over the past year drilling into this risk. In fact, there's a few examples here in the next few slides that I think I never really saw much of going back like 3-4 years. And so a lot of work has been put into this. So I'll highlight some of the work out of MISO's RRA assessment, where they look out into the future. and say, well, what does the system risk look like in that future portfolio? Again, one with a lot more wind, solar on the system. And what they've done is come up with these neat graphics that show, like, when there's load events in the spring, summer, fall, and winter, what does the underlying system conditions look like? And so at the bottom, you can see the loss of load probability shaded in green across like a day here. So from hour 0 to hour 24. And you can see that for each season. And so different seasons will have different risk at different times. And then you can also see when there are unserved energy events, what does the underlying load profile look like? What does the underlying wind and solar look like? And try to get a better grasp on, first of all, when are these risk events occurring? And then when they do occur, what is the underlying resource mix doing? And can we draw any conclusions to that? This is kind of like the first glimpse of that type of analysis. And I'll kind of go through a few different ways to slice and dice the data here. So what I think is important is drilling into the risk profile, understanding when the risk is occurring, why it's occurring, and when it does occur, how large are these unserved energy events that we have to mitigate. So another example, this is from E3's Resource Adequacy in the Desert Southwest report. I thought they did a really nice job visualizing kind of the shifting risk over time. And this is something we've seen very similarly. If you look at the top, you see in 2021, the risk is occurring. This is loss of load risk, right? So when you have insufficient supply to meet demand, it's occurring in the late afternoon to early evening hours. And then as you move to 2025, you see it move to just the very evening peak. So essentially solar is pushing that out. And then when you move to 2033, you see it push even further into the evening and into early morning hours, which traditionally have very little risk. And that's as you push, the solar is pushing the risk later into the overnight periods, and storage starts to deplete over time. So again, even with systems that have the exact same aggregate risk profile of 0.1 LOLE, you see the timing of the risk start to shift, the shape of that risk starts to shift. We see the same thing, I talked about that on the ERCOT side, same thing, as we push the system out, the risk shifts into the overnight period. What you'll also see here at the bottom is kind of the heat map of kind of months going down the row and hour of the day going across the columns, and you can see a very concentrated period of risk. So this is really helpful when we're looking at programs, whether they be demand response programs or energy efficiency, kind of targeting certain types of loads that are most prevalent in that period can be very helpful. And then it's also important to track this over time, because what we see in many regions, and I've looked at this in a few cases where this is the case, including ERCOT, like I just mentioned, you'll see this heat map start to like actually move away from that summer evening period, because solar and storage are so well equipped at clipping off that risk. And you'll see it start moving to the winter months and into the overnight hours. And based on the work I've done, I really think, well, there's a lot of folks out there that say, well, peak demand, most summer peaking regions today will become winter peaking because of electrification of heating demand and electrification of transportation. Yes, that will happen. I think that's a relatively slow overall trend. I think we'll actually flip to winter risk period much sooner than that. So, something to keep an eye on. This is a really great tool to do that. Another way to visualize risk, and I think I shared similar charts to this during the last webinar I gave on topic a year ago, but this is again coming out of the work Elaine Hart and Anna Maleva did for Grid Lab, looking at resource adequacy in the Western interconnection. So this is interconnection wide to the Western US, looking at event distribution. And they did this for many different cases. I forget which one this is taken from exactly, but you can see the event distribution on the left, kind of looking at when there is an event, how long did the event last for? You can see in this case, the vast majority were 4 hours or less. And then, so already you start thinking, well, resources like storage and demand response and load flexibility can be very effective if it's a relatively short event like that. And so that immediately begs the question, well, what does that mean? When there's an event, how large is the event in terms of the maximum shortage? and what was the total amount of energy. So we don't really care about duration. We care about shortage in terms of megawatts and shortage in terms of energy. And you can see these heat maps that they used in the report do a really nice job of really encapsulating if we need a resource, how big should it be? And you can see in this case, and this is again interconnection wide, a 4 gigawatt resource with call it 10 to 12 gigawatt hours would cover the vast majority of the shortfall events and significantly reduce the remaining ones. So this type of forensics, this type of analysis is really critical. If anybody, anyone's trying to justify a new resource going in on the grounds of reliability or resource adequacy, making sure this is presented to the stakeholders, presented to the decision makers is critical, because it really helps you hone in on what the right type of resource is to solve the reliability challenge. And lastly, on one other way to characterize risk, again, this is an example we showed coming out of some of the work we did for the ESIG Redefining Resource Adequacy Task Force. We took that same example that I highlighted last year. We applied this, and this is for that same ERCOT case study I was talking to before that we did on behalf of EPRI and their resource adequacy for decarbonization. And you can see, again, what this chart is showing is a scatter plot of individual events. So again, we often plan systems. So the metric used in most of North America, at least, is 1 day in 10-year loss of load expectation. So 1 day of shortfall every 10 years. And so this chart is showing each of those shortfall events on a single scatter plot. And so you can see it's ranked across the x-axis by duration. So how long did the event last for? On the y-axis, what was the maximum shortfall during that event? And you can see kind of there's a trade-off between very small or short duration events and relatively small up into the, as you move up into the right, they become much more large and impactful. So this is something I find really useful, because the way most places are handling resource adequacy today, we treat all of our events the same, right? It's like we count the number of events there are and the probability of an event, but we don't disaggregate, well, should we give preference to mitigating some of the really large, high impact events more than some of the smaller ones? I think that's a valuable question for regulators and policymakers to think about. So the other thing I wanted to highlight in this is not just the way to visualize individual events. It's funny, like all of these charts are very interactive, and then I end up pasting them as images into a static PowerPoint presentation. But the idea here is you can highlight over any of these events and say, well, when did that occur? What weather year? What dates? And start to get more insight into specific drivers. So you can see, in 2023, 30% of all the events occurred on 2 weather days on a single weather year. So it's a really hot period and an outlier event that was driving a lot of risk. Fast forward to 2030, again, a system, we're not trying to be exact on what we think the system will look like in 2030, but it's one that has a lot more solar, a lot more storage, and a lot more wind. And you can see the colors of the dots went from red, which is summer, and to blue, which is winter. So almost all of them are at least 60, 70% of the events now occur in the winter, and certainly all of the large events occur in the winter. And specifically, again, if you drill down into the events themselves, you see that 50% of them are occurring on 3 weather days in the historical record. And so really understanding what the system conditions look like under those weather conditions is really critical. And lastly, I guess I got to speed it up because I have 2 more sections. I'll speed it up. One is on kind of the importance of evaluating neighboring grids and transmission. It's a key part of the resource adequacy challenge. So again, kind of highlighting some of the work being done in NSOE in the ERAA assessment, 39 transmission operators across 35 countries, and they do this a single resource adequacy assessment, doing probabilistic analysis across that, and you can see how they run different scenarios. I think the one on the left is for kind of what everybody's estimating with new capacity builds and retaining some of the thermal units. On the right is kind of without a capacity mechanism. So basically without incenting resources to stay around or procuring new resources, you can see loss of load increase, and you can see kind of on a country by country or region by region basis where that loss of load is occurring. So it's really great. I think important, again, it's all using the same underlying weather data set to make sure we're seeing correlation of risk across the system. And another good example of that, again, doing a multi-utility, multi-balancing authority is, again, the E3 resource adequacy in the desert Southwest, which shows there's large opportunities for regional capacity sharing. So basically, if you look at the bottom left, you can see a system that in 2025, without any additional mitigation, would have a surplus, I guess, in this case of 760 megawatts. But if you show with regional support, there's a lot more kind of this capacity interchange between regions would grow substantially. And I thought that what that report did really well was go through, well, what does that mean to really rely on a neighbor for resource adequacy? And really highlighted that, well, each utility remains responsible for planning their portfolio. That's how it is today, and really talked about this formalized protocol for sharing of capacity and sharing risk across a much wider system. And this is one of the main reasons for having that push systems into kind of the ISO RTO footprint to begin with. But there's, I think, alternative mechanisms. We don't have to go fully deregulated. I think the RAP in the Northwest is a great example of that, where we can do capacity sharing on an interregional basis. But we have to come up with that framework. So again, highlighting the work out of, and a good segue talking about that regional framework of capacity sharing, the Northwest Resource Adequacy Program, the Western Resource Adequacy Program, or the RAP. You can see that's currently under development, I believe going live here in the next year or two. But all the balancing authorities highlighted in orange here, part of that RAP program, and with the idea of doing resource adequacy planning across a wide region and making sure it's much easier to do bilaterals and trade capacity across the region. What I thought the best thing that came out of the grid path study that was released last week was showing what the system looks like if each sub-area is modeled as an island versus if there's kind of flow of resources across the system, while still maintaining the transmission limits between regions, but just making sure you could rely on imports and exports for resource adequacy. And you can see the risk just really reduce going from those two cases. Now, I'm not thinking we can go all the way to that anytime soon necessarily, but it does show that the risk, there's huge opportunities for capacity sharing across a system, even just the size of the Western US. And one thing that some work we did last year as well, really tried to understand, well, if you're relying on neighboring systems for resource adequacy, how do we think about that? If we don't have firm contracts in place, how do we think about risk in a world like that? And so that we spent a lot of time thinking about that same question in some of the work we were doing in California last year, which California has always had a component of their system that is dependent on imports from the rest of the West. And there's a question as we go forward, how do you plan for resource adequacy if some of the imports are kind of non-firm, if you don't have a contract in place? And so what we've seen is that assumption on how much you assume can be imported in the resource adequacy models during an event, that assumption becomes the driving factor of loss of load expectation and the driving factor of resource adequacy. So all of the analysis becomes very hinged on, well, how willing are we to rely on imports? That one assumption can become one of the biggest drivers. And so we try to drill into that a little bit more in the California context. and said, well, let's look at risk, not just on when there's unserved energy, because that's going to be fully predicated on what we assume for the import capability. You can see this in some of the results coming out of resource adequacy analyses in California. So rather than do that, we said, well, let's not set a fixed import limit. Let's allow imports to do what they do based on availability of resources across the West and price differences. And let's just look at how much the system is dispatching in-state gas, here in gray, importing economic, non-firm, non-contracted resources, and let's compare that against the available in-state gas. And so the delta between that is basically saying, well, if all of the imports go away, what do I have left? And so anytime, and that's what we're plotting here on the bottom, is this California gas margin. And so it says anytime that goes very low or negative, that's a point where we're actually relying on economic imports, non-firm imports for reliability. And so that's kind of a new metric to track, and that's something that I thought we did very differently. And lastly, on the interregional capacity sharing, I wanted to highlight work that we did for ESIG, again, earlier this year on looking at multi-value benefits of transmission. And specifically, we looked at interregional links of transmission between regions. The main play for that, while there's use for energy arbitrage, and maybe it's an opportunity for one region to get lower cost renewables, the main reason for having interregional transmission is really to share this capacity. And so the big key here is, if you want to understand value of transmission, of interregional transmission, you have to treat transmission as a capacity resource, or as a way to mitigate loss of load risk. So again, we looked at ERCOT in isolation, we looked at Southern Company in isolation, and we said, well, if you link those because they have disparate weather conditions, because their peak loads are uncorrelated most of the time, you can see that we intentionally set both systems to be unreliable, or at over 0.3 days per year LOLE. And when you connect them with an HVDC, even without any new resources being added, you can see both systems kind of go below the reliability criterion. And we calculated for transmission resource had essentially a 200% capacity credit, because it was able to count as, equivalent to a thermal resource or gas capacity in both markets. So it could provide 2 gigawatts of benefit in ERCOT, 2 gigawatts of benefit in Southern, and so it was actually double the capability, again, just by doing resource sharing. So the thing to remember there is, if we want to value interregional transmission for resource adequacy, we have to consider it as a resource, just like. And the last section I'll get to in just a couple minutes, although a lot of really great work that I wanted to highlight, is this idea around there's no such thing as perfect capacity. And really, I think the resource adequacy analysis in the past has done a great job characterizing the availability of wind and solar and storage resources. We've understood those to be variable. We've understood them to be energy limited, and we spent a lot of time as an industry understanding and how to model that. We haven't spent as much time understanding the underlying variability and correlated outages on the thermal fleet. I would say we haven't done that up until the last couple of years. And so the idea being that in conventional resource adequacy analysis, we've always assumed thermal outages to be uncorrelated to one another. But in reality, we see correlated outages on the thermal fleet all the time. We just don't characterize it well in our resource adequacy analysis. So Astrape did some great work this year, but I think seminal work in this space to really lay out what is some of the correlated outages we can see across the thermal fleet. They talked about outage variability, so just you might have a forced outage rate of resources at 5% long-term average, just that will vary from times of being 2% of the system to 10% of the system, and really that variability drives resource adequacy risk. And right now, all of that risk falls on the ratepayer because they're just taking that in the planning reserve margin. In reality, we can kind of put that onto the thermal resources themselves in the way of an ELCC. And then it goes further to talk about weather-dependent outages, just increased forced outage rates during extreme heat and extreme cold. and then fuel availability outages. And they go through a nice process of showing how each of those would affect the accreditation of the resource. And you can see today, most places, well, some places are still using installed capacity of thermal resources as their ELCC. Most places are discounting those by their UCAP or unforced capacity, so the capacity minus the forced outage rate. But then if you layer in these, you get a very different answer. So kind of starting at 100 or 95%, and in the winter being below 80, and similarly in the summer. So I thought that was really great work talking about this idea, kind of tying back to that concept of there's no such thing as perfect capacity. We really need to be applying these types of concepts across the resource mixes. Everything has limitations we need to consider. And all of that work is being kind of based on some kind of foundational work by Sinat Murphy that really was the first to look into, or the first that I know that really looked into, well, what are these temperature dependencies? So he sifted through gobs and gobs of NERC GADS data to understand what is the outage rate of resources based on the ambient conditions when they went on outage. And he developed curves. This is an example of the outage rate curves for a combustion turbine on the left and a nuclear unit on the right. You can see they're very temperature dependent. And so while the average might be for a CT 3%, you can see at the tail ends of these distributions, while it's, it might be rare to get this cold, the outage rate is much higher. So we need to tie that into our resource adequacy models. Almost nobody is doing that, at least up into the last few months. So kind of cutting edge research being done by a lot of folks to really show the implications of this. And one example of kind of tying the weather dependent outages is work that we are doing, again, part of the EPRI analysis, looking at weather dependent outages on thermal resources in ERCOT. Again, taking that Sinat Murphy data, the curves that I was talking about in the last slide, putting that in into now every resource in ERCOT we modeled on a daily basis, its forced outage rate would vary based on the temperature that resource was seeing, and again, across 40 years. And you can see this top chart is showing a box plot of forced outage, capacity on forced outage across 40 years of weather across 600 samples. So there's, for each day of the year, there's 600 different forced outage draws. And you can see most of the time, the system bounces between, call it 2 and 4 gigawatts on outage most of the time. You can see there's some outliers that makes that band a little bit wider. And then there's some times where you just get unlucky and you roll the dice and there's, call it between 6 and 8 gigawatts on outage. But you can see this is the conventional approach, that's assuming thermal resources are uniformly available across the year. And you can see we have some unserved energy events highlighted in red, and it's kind of random when they're occurring. You can see the blue line is just showing that, yeah, on average, we're hitting the same amount of capacity. Now, kind of fast forward, introduce some of those temperature dependent outages I was just talking about, and you can see this curve looks very different. You can see, both an increase in the winter and an increase in the summer when we get to both extremes of the temperature curve. The interesting thing, though, is if you look at the annual average outage rate, that blue line, that's unchanged from the case with no temperature dependency. So yeah, again, on average, we're not talking about anything significant. Even on a monthly average, you don't really see it change much. So that's the orange line. What's really key is these outlier events. So they might be rare where it gets very cold, but when it does, you can see we have a cluster of events. And this is, again, that one weather event I was talking about earlier in the presentation. So this type of work, making sure we're getting correlated weather-dependent outages on the thermal resources, I'd say that's really cutting-edge work that's being done in the industry right now, and something that I think you'll see a lot more of in the next year or so. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'm not going to go over the last two principles. Again, you can see the earlier webinar on that topic. Another reason I'm not going to talk about it is because I haven't seen as much work in this space. So I think two places where I could see a lot of work coming next is around load participation and really understanding the implications of that and resource adequacy. So specifically, if we think about the IRA and just how much we'll see a growth in electric vehicles and building electrification. I think that's untapped territory for future work. And then lastly, on this idea around tying the reliability criterion, potentially changing the reliability criterion first, and then secondly, moving towards one that's based on economic principles rather than just what I would call an arbitrary 1 day in 10 year probability. So I think both of those, while we highlighted the importance of it in the ESIG white paper a year ago, I think there's opportunity for both of those for more work. And with that, I will flip over to Slido and we will go to questions. So Julia, do you want to?
All right, thank you, Derek. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'll start with the most popular one. Have you had success in getting utilities to use probabilistic array tools? And do you have any advice to get more of them to do it?
Yeah, great question. So yes, utilities are starting to do probabilistic analysis with some of these RA tools. I think some of these methods are starting to enter into the utility space. I'd say there's still a dependence where you do see it happen. A lot of times they're contracting out to consultants and third parties to come in and do that. There's certainly, as most parts of the energy industry right now, there's lack of personnel and human capital is a big constraint on the system. And so I think that'll continue. I do think utilities are starting to move in that direction. I know HECO, for example, brought in the probabilistic resource adequacy assessment over the past year. I'll just highlight them as an example. Others are working with consultants to bring that in, and then a lot are doing it in-house as well.
All right, thank you. The next question is, you mentioned synthetic data being used sometimes. What are issues, concerns with doing that? Can you?
Yeah, so this I will point a little bit to the ESIG task force on whether that Justin Sharp is leading. And so basically we'll have a paper out that addresses some of this specifically. I do have concerns around where I see some of the bootstrapping. So I call this bootstrapping of taking kind of filling gaps in the data. And it's nothing malignant. It's just malicious. It's just, we have to fill data somehow. And you'll see people do this differently across the industry. What I see a lot is just maybe you take a couple of years of wind and solar data and you say, well, I'll take the daily temperature from those days and I'll bootstrap that all the way back 50 years. And I'll use 50 years of temperature data because that's what I have. And I'll take 2 years of wind and solar and just like sample around that. I think that's troubling. I always push towards getting kind of underlying atmospheric data, underlying atmospheric conditions modeled to the extent where I'd even go so far as to use a lower number of weather years if it has the correlated wind, solar, weather load data set with it. So yeah, I think that's a huge, that is a concern. I think it's, potentially misrepresenting the risk on the system. And I think the solution to that is we just need better data in the industry so we don't have to do that bootstrapping.
Right, thanks. The next question is there a best practice to account for renewable forecast error in resource adequacy analysis?
So that's a great question. There's a philosophy or a debate on forecast error in resource adequacy analysis. I personally think this is kind of like right on the edge of should it be in resource adequacy analysis or should it be in something else. I think for the most part, the forecast error really can be handled with a non-spinning reserve. So yes, we need to plan for it. We need to make sure we procure and have enough non-spinning reserve on the system or spinning reserve, part spin, part non-spin. I don't necessarily know that we need to kind of plan out our capacity needs based on that. Obviously, it goes in as an input to our long-term planning and our long-term capacity expansion. Not sure it falls in or out of the resource adequacy envelope. The one potential thought I have on that is around energy storage modeling and making sure that gets captured. The forecast error in terms of do you discharge too early or do you hold on to, and lose state of charge that you otherwise would have kept because there's going to be a loss of load event. I think if you look back to the Labor Day conditions in California. There's some, because of some market rules and issues, some of the storage dispatched earlier in the day when it probably would have been best to keep it on late in the evening. So an example like that. I think in general, though, resource adequacy events are fairly easy to predict in the kind of in the day ahead or real time.
Near term.
Yeah, in the near term. So I actually don't think that forecast error is significant for the RA. Significant for system planning, but not for necessarily for RA.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question is, the case studies are on generation and transmission adequacy. Did you find any good studies on probabilistic adequacy assessment of distribution networks?
No, but that's also because I didn't look. So this is a valid question. I think in applying the same probabilistic assessment, well, I wouldn't necessarily call it resource adequacy, but applying the same probabilistic methods to distribution networks makes a lot of sense. So I will say on a lot of these studies are starting to evaluate DER across multiple weather years and understanding, well, what is the rooftop solar going to do across wide geographies? So we'll typically sample data across really wide regions, like down to zip code level, and then do that across many, many weather years. And so that's one way, but I don't think that's getting to the question. That's still fault.
Yeah, I wonder if there is any kind of connection where you're looking at transmission, transmission adequacy in resource adequacy assessment, if you're relying on DERs in your resource adequacy assessment, and if there are distribution constraints that could play a role.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of also the interface between RA and resilience, which is a very fuzzy interface, but sometimes I'll put kind of distribution outages on a resilience framework, but again, probably no good rationale for that.
All right, let's go to the next one. Is there consensus on how many years of weather history should be used to capture a range of weather outcomes that affect load and correlated outages?
No, I think the short answer is there is no consensus yet, because going longer isn't always better. So if you have, this is something I talked a little bit about on the ERCOT case study. We have a lot in the study about this. Like if you go back 40 years, you end up with a very different answer than if you go back 20 or 10. And so it does swing the results around quite a bit, even more so as you move out to a higher renewable system. I don't think there's consensus. I would say if I were to, maybe my recommendation would be like the 10 to 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think we'll take one last one. Great material, Derek. Have you considered temperature derates beyond forced outages?
So yes, great point. I should have mentioned that. So yes, there's two ways to model, or I guess there's three weather-dependent outages that you can really think about in the space. One is just temperature-related derates. So when it gets really hot, gas turbine has less output, right? And it gets really cold, there's an impact as well. So yes, that is being captured as well. So there's temperature-dependent derates, and then there's temperature-dependent outage rates. And then the third category is fuel supply. And I haven't gotten my hands around how we model fuel supply better. That's kind of the intersection of multiple disciplines, but something I think is really important. So all three of those factors are going to, but yes, we are modeling temperature-dependent derates. I know some of the other studies, I think the Estrope study did as well.
All right, so we're about the top of the hour, and we need to wrap up. Derek, thank you once again for a very interesting presentation. I learned a few things, and I'm sure the participants learned a lot as well. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the video file has been posted, and we'll get the responses to all unanswered questions posted as quickly as possible. And there were many questions, Derek, so you'll have some extra work to do.
And maybe I can answer some of these next week if people are going to be in Minneapolis.
Yes, that would be great. So we appreciate your engagement, and if you would like to stay engaged, I would like to invite you to participate in the next ESIG webinar, which is on November 3rd, and it's on Odessa disturbance event and Texas interconnection. Further information on all of ESIG webinars can be found on our website at www.nosig.org. www.esig.energy under events, and you are also invited to attend all of those. Information on G-PST webinars can be found at www.globalpst.org. Derek, I would like to thank you once again for this very timely webinar, and thank you all for your interest. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future, and in the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation. Bye now.